Welcome back to Around the Prompt. This is Logan Kilpatrick. I'm really excited to share this conversation that Nolan and I had with Yohei Nakajima. We talked about agents, Baby AGI, untapped capital, and a bunch of other stuff that you'll be incredibly interested in, so stick around. Yohei is definitely the premier thinker in the world of agents, so I'm excited to share this conversation with you.
Hey, thanks for being here. Really excited for this conversation. I'm wondering if you can, diving actually back in time a little bit, if you can take us back to when you first started building maybe AGI, which if you want to explain what it is for folks who perhaps haven't seen it, but I'm curious, what was the inspiration for Baby AGI? And also what's the state of Baby AGI today as a project or experiment?
Yeah, so Baby AGI was March of last year. I started building on top of OpenAI in August, so I've been building a whole bunch of prototypes, kind of both to use at our VC firm and also to just learn about what the tech can do. And in March with Baby AGI, I guess for people not familiar, it was kind of the first popular open source autonomous agent, specifically with task planning capability, where I was using LLMs to generate task list and kind of looping through the task list, generating new tasks and executing them one by one. The inspiration was actually a project called Hustle GPT, if you remember. I forgot his name, but some guy started using ChatGPT as like a co-founder and said, "I have $100. Like, what should I do?" And just doing whatever ChatGPT said to grow it. And then a Discord community grew, and a whole bunch of people were doing, and it just seemed like so much fun. But I realized they were all just doing whatever ChatGPT told them. So I thought, well, can I get an AI to do that part as well? And so the initial challenge was prototyping an autonomous startup founder. And then when I shared a demo video online, people started asking if they could do more than that. So I started giving it random objectives, and it definitely did start thinking about how to do anything. But it was only 100 lines of code, so it was really more of a template to build off of than anything else.
Yeah, do you know what happened to the Hustle GPT thing? That I feel like that was like the blowing up and having this incredible moment. I feel like I don't know if I just don't know the guy or the person who made it, but I feel like I haven't heard anything from them since.
I haven't heard much recently. Yeah, I think he like it generated some revenue at some point, but I think some of it was sponsorships, and then I didn't hear much after that.
Got it. That makes sense. And I'm curious, I saw a tweet from you, it had to have been not many months, but some months ago about trying to hand off the Baby AGI sort of like IP and project to somebody else to run with. I'm curious, did that end up coming to fruition? Did you find someone?
I worked with a few guys at Spark, and we kind of looked at the business and the opportunities, and it was a great. I mean, if anything, it was really the greatest thing was kind of kickstarting the community of people building autonomous agents, which kind of picked up everywhere, and I got to connect with a lot of builders. I was personally more interested in just like in the like getting this community going, right? I think there was so much to be built, right? I mean, Baby Asia was such a simple template. There was so much work to do in terms of security and memory, and we're still trying to tackle all of it. So really, my focus was more than anything just like get people to start building and sharing their ideas. Since launching Baby AGI, I'd released a couple of mods where I kind of went back to my original code and just have been modding it myself. And I've used it more as a way to introduce ideas. So I've implemented types of kind of self-improvement, tool libraries, being able to write its own skills, having a UI layer. So I've kind of released these mods using animal names like Baby Bee AGI, Baby Cat AGI. But candidly, I'm not great at managing open source repos, so I definitely didn't capture the incredible energy that was coming toward the project. But I think it was part of it was being torn between wanting this to be as simple template as possible because there were so many directions it could be taken, and I was more interested in kind of catalyzing the communication around the different approaches happening online, and I think that's been pretty successful. And I'm still sharing new research that comes out regularly. I think there's a few today that came out that seemed interesting.
That's awesome. And I guess, yeah, you kind of touching on untapped capital. Trying to think of an investment thesis here. What investment thesis have you guys rolled out with, and have there been modifications or changes with the rapid development and advancements of large language models and AI? How are you guys kind of still staying true to your core values, or is it difficult kind of in this time?
Yeah, well, we've always been a firm, even before the kind of LLM boom, that was really tech driven. So I actually built our whole fund on a no code backend back in 2020. So our whole stack is like Airtable, Zapier, Softer, like no code through and through. It allows us to run a lot of automation. So even before I started building with OpenAI, I was running like 10 to 15 zaps a month. And then when I started playing with the API, initially I was actually I don't know if you guys remember, but I actually built the first Zapier OpenAI integration that was unofficial that I was just using for myself before I handed it off to Zapier to start supporting officially. So it was just like I just realized I could just plug one OpenAI call in my existing workflows, and suddenly my tools were 10 times more powerful. So I was using I quickly shot up to like 30,000 Zapier calls a month when I started using LLM. Our thesis has always been to invest in kind of great founders, sometimes outside of kind of traditional VC circles, maybe those that aren't that well connected to VCs, but building in big markets with a unique insight. And that's always stayed true. And again, our unique approach is that we play with whatever the latest technology is as a way to kind of learn about it quickly and get to meet the founders. So as I mentioned, in 2020, it was no code. In 2021, I've launched an NFT collection. And since 2022, I've been building on top of OpenAI. So it's a fun way for me to engage with the founder community.
I love that. I'm curious how you're finding people who are outside of the traditional VC communities. Like, is it like from your public presence and stuff like that, or are you doing like intentional outreach? I feel like there's so much saturation and excitement these days that, yeah, I'm curious how you're sourcing people.
Yeah, it's a lot of we do a lot of outbound. I like reaching out to founders. And I look at a lot of the companies we come across. I find on Product Hunt, for example, like right when somebody's trying to launch, or on Twitter as well. These days, now that I have kind of this build-in public attention from people of me building in public, one hack I found is that if there's an idea I'm interested in, I could use ChatGPT to prototype something over a weekend, and if I share it, founders who are working on that idea will find it and then reach out to me. So that's been a really nice kind of way to it's my request for startups is whenever I open source a little prototype.
Yeah, I would say that's very interesting. And something else too that came to mind. No, you were talking about staying constantly on top of this technology, which seems like almost an impossible task with AI and large language models now, because it seems like almost every day, there's a new organization or a platform or a tool coming out. So, how do you kind of go about keeping a good harness on leveraging new technology, but also, basically being able to quickly adapt and say, maybe that's not a technology you want to go, or, the fundamentals behind that technology are not something we want to play around with. What is your kind of, process of looking at those technologies and seeing if it's something that would actually be useful to you?
It's a mix of, I'd say, trusting my gut instinct. So I think a part of that is just looking at a lot of things, reading a lot of things, consuming a lot of information. Which trains my gut instinct through pattern matching, similar to just exposing a model to a lot of relevant data so that it can recall it later. And then the other is actually tracking it, whether it be Twitter bookmarks, or I have a couple bookmarking. If it's a startup, I use a bookmarking tool that'll then ingest it into my CRM and then use AI and scraping to kind of like add more information to it. So a combination of just having a huge top of funnel in terms of like looking at Twitter, reading things, looking at lists of startups, and then tracking the ones I want to be able to recall, and then of course embedding them and then building a search function on top so I can find them later easily. Every startup in our CRM is automatically embedded, so I can quickly search for an idea that I've come across before, and if I've bookmarked it before, it's pretty good at recalling it.
I'm curious on the topic of building AI tools to augment the venture capital space. You've been making a bunch of those GPTs and putting them out around different, I think one of them is like mean VC. Yeah, custom GPTs are really cool to like get something going super quickly and just like see what the experience would be like. I'm curious, like what's getting you most excited in that custom GPT space? Like do you actually think that like long term there's like some product market fit with these type of like AI VC tools? Like, do you think you would actually be like a customer of some company, I don't know, if AngelList or something like that puts together a bunch of these type of AI tools for venture capital people? Do you think there's like a real market, or is it kind of like gimmicky and fun to do, but like not really very practically useful?
So I think there's two parts to that question. I think is there a product for the VC market? And I think that's a challenging one. I think the VC market is just a tough market to sell or build into. Obviously, AngelList has done a good job, but realistically, the VC market isn't that big. If you look at AngelList, I mean, many of them are angels, right? There's probably more angels than VCs on that platform. VCs are a small market. The big ones with money have a lot of systems built in, so they're slower to change, and the smaller VC funds just don't have that much capital. So it's hard to build a product for that market. That being said, do I think AI will be used in VC moving forward? Absolutely. Do I think it's going to be across the board? Not for a long time. I mean, there's been firms like Correlation Ventures and whatnot that have used more traditional big data style kind of AI to find signals, and that's been happening for over 10 years. Obviously, there's a lot of benefit to it, but that doesn't mean that you need it to be successful in a VC. And if it's not required, it's not going to be everybody who's using it. I'm already getting a whole bunch out of it, right? Like our VC associate that I built, probably in like 30 minutes at the beginning of January has had, I think the last I checked, it was like 9,000 chats. It's adding value to founders, and maybe I'm not capturing that data necessarily. But I like to spend time going to accelerators and meeting founders and seeing where I can be helpful, but my time is to some extent limited. I mean, if a few percent of the 8,000 chats was helpful to the founder, that just scaled my ability to help kind of founders at large. I think the mean VC, which just hit 1,000, I think is even more helpful than the VC associate. That one just pokes holes in a founder's assumptions and just kind of keeps digging in, asking the tough questions. I've actually started using that on a day-to-day when our portfolio companies are kicking off a raise. We'll set a schedule to go over their narrative. And then as homework, I'll say, why don't you go battle test mean VC a few times before our call? And so I'm using mean VC as the bad cop, and then they can get the tough questions from this AI, and then I can come in and help guide them through thinking through those questions.
That's super interesting. I'm curious if you think like, building the next step of the using GPTs to sort of have these full play interactions. I'm wondering if like the HeyGens of the world are going to end up helping people augment this even further. Like I can imagine, I have a digital version of Paul Graham or something like that, and I'm pitching, and like it's pulling from the large database of Paul Graham blog post or whatever, and like giving me feedback based on that. Do you think that that's going to happen? And I'm also curious how useful you think that will be. Like I'm wondering if there's like all the nuances of maybe without having like video recordings of some person like actually giving the feedback, if you can like take even your writings that you've done online or other talks that you've given, like, is that actually going to be like a useful proxy for founders for what you would say in the actual engagement?
That's a good question. I think that might be pretty tough, specific to the VC space. So much of a VC's thinking isn't in public. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but even then, it's usually somewhat crafted in terms of what they like. As a VC, I don't really want to publicly talk down upon companies or founders I meet, even if I don't feel necessarily positive about them. So there's a lot of bias in the data where you're not going to get a lot of their negative thoughts, just because we're less incentivized to share kind of details, and probably the most interesting notes and conversations are happening privately amongst VCs. Of course, to some extent, it could be helpful in terms of kind of helping you prepare a little bit in terms of knowing a few things to talk about, but whether or not you need to actually talk to a full-on AI chatbot to get that benefit is unclear. I almost feel like a couple of bullet points on like key things about your business that would stand out to that person that's automatically embedded in your calendar as a note that pops up might almost be just as effective, if not easy, quicker, right? Because you're jumping from VC to VC. You don't want to have to practice a VC call with every VC you're going to jump on a call with.
A quick question. From Untapped Capital's perspective, obviously you guys are working with a multitude of verticals and industries. Since this, I guess going back over a little over a year now, since this boom of AI and just large language models, has there been a specific vertical in which you've seen just a absurd amount of innovation where you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize, maybe it's pharmaceutical or even sports and I don't know, just different industry wise, has there been anything that you're like, holy cow, AI has really helped this industry grow over the last 12, 14, 16 months?
I'd say what industry hasn't been impacted to some extent, but a slow curve of it actually being implemented. I mean, the places that I feel like the value is coming quickest is kind of research related tasks. I almost think of it less of like industry by industry, but there's certain tasks that AI is really good at that people have solved, right? Doing some basic retrieval through certain documents, combining a web search or a web scrape with summarizing. I think that has added immense value in terms of just efficiency across the board for all kind of digital workers, I guess. But if I were to pick an industry, healthcare is one that I've seen a lot of just activity.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. I think that's a common thread. And I guess, working with startups too, how do you go about helping these startups create a competitive advantage or a moat around their offering? Again, in such a saturated market, and, like I said, companies and organizations coming about day in and day out, how do you work with your startups to tackle some of those
Yeah,
issues?
of course, it depends on each company, but ultimately, I think it does come down to fundamentals of really figuring out who your customer is, right? And not just like your total addressable market, but in terms of go-to-market strategy, who are you going after? Why are you going after them? Most startups probably, especially with AI, they're probably 10,000 things they want to do and all the benefits they want to provide to them, but really honing in on what's the right go-to-market that allows you to capture their attention. I mean, of course, get the credit card, keep them so you can keep adding value while making money. I feel like I've caught myself saying like, what's your Amazon books, right? I mean, it's just the most obvious one, but Amazon starting with books with a really strategic play that analyzed books as the right market to tackle building an e-commerce giant. And I think a similar question can apply to most startups, whatever vertical you're in, right? Who's that super targeted niche that you can immediately add value to? And really just delivering that value.
Yeah, I'm curious if you have any companies that y'all have invested in that are perhaps going after like some very untraditional markets or like some like really competitive markets that you think like just because of whatever the reason is, the founding team, the product that they're building, like they have a very outside shot of actually like winning. I'm curious.
About most of my companies, which is why we invested in them. I think a fun one is Wokello, where I had been building kind of our own AI analyst who, if I bookmark a startup, it'll go scrape the website, it'll do some reasoning to understand who the customer is, some high level risks. We do some vector searches to look for the most similar startups in our CRM, similar unicorns and whatnot. So it's pretty powerful, and we use it for every company that we just automatically runs on their CRM. But came across a company called Wokello that's building due diligence kind of research tools for VCs, M&As, consultants. And especially because I've been building it myself, when I saw what their output was, I was just blown away. And then when I talked to them and I looked at the back end, their prompt management system in terms of like testing and improving and selecting the right prompt was extremely built out, and it almost felt like a startup on its own that they were using in the back end. And I was very jealous of what they built out to be able to make this powerful report. So it was a pretty obvious investment for us to make, given that it was a space that I understood. And it's been incredible working with them and been able to bring them a lot of kind of VCs, M&As, PEs, consultants to start leveraging their tools. And they've been very
I love that. I'm also curious, like that makes me think about what your, and this could be personal or work, AI productivity stack looks like. Like, is it like one-off tools that you built yourself, or are you using like a lot of out of the box, like a ChatGPT or Perplexity or something like that for your own like personal workflows as you're doing things?
It's a mix. I mean, ChatGPT is still probably my number one that I come to use. I've just gotten really good at using ChatGPT prompts, so that's my go-to, especially if I'm coding or whatnot. I use a ton of OpenAI just kind of in the back end automatically, as I mentioned, right? Summarizing every email I get, extracting bullet points, scraping websites, analyzing those. So those are kind of just running in the back end. The stack is either Zapier, which is in our no code flow, and I'm just using OpenAI, Zapier, either ChatGPT or OpenAI call. And then if it's in code, it's usually Replit Python Flask app that I have ChatGPT built for me. And I slowly made the migration from no code to code as I got better and better at coding with ChatGPT.
Were you previously non-technical, like no coding background, and you made this transition because of AI, or did you have some like technical background in the past?
I've never had a technical job, but I've been coding as a hobby since high school. So I've never been a developer, but I've played around plenty. Dangerous enough to know how to break things.
I guess another question is, how do you see kind of this agent movement, playing out moving forward at a high level?
I think the toughest reason to answer that question is I think the term agent is such a kind of a fuzzy word, and then autonomous agent just like makes it even fuzzier to some extent. But if you think of agents as kind of chaining prompts and kind of logic flows together, and then autonomous agent is kind of one that does that on its own. Internally, at least the language I've been using within autonomous agents is what I would call handcrafted autonomous agents, which is where you're writing each prompt and you're chaining them together. Our AI analyst is handcrafted in that I wrote every single prompt and it's chained together, versus a kind of a fully autonomous agent that will generate its own task list and then kind of tackle those. That's the kind of AutoGPT, Baby AGI style kind of fully autonomous agents. What I realized after playing with them, that they eventually merged, because what I started doing was storing the task lists into a memory bank so that the autonomous agents would use previous task lists as like a source of knowledge to do task lists. So it was interesting that as I started building both, the handcrafted agent's data was helping the autonomous agent be able to do the same thing because it could just look at that task list that the handcrafted autonomous agent built. So the two ideas start to merge is something I noticed. But looking more at the current landscape of where the value is going to be created, for most companies, the most valuable tasks to automate are the ones that they do all the time. And if it's something they do all the time, they should write the task themselves and not have an AI generate the task list. So the most value to be created today in the short term is these, what I was calling handcrafted autonomous agents, where you're finding a very often repeated task within an organization, making that automatic for them so that they can save time on that task. And I think for those, you have kind of two approaches to do it, doing it more flexibly, building it. So that kind of building a tool that people can use to kind of craft their own change, which is kind of what I was doing with Zapier, but you're seeing more and more tools that allow for this kind of training versus some tools that have found a general task list that's done across all organizations in an industry and will just will tailor a tool that's out of the box useful to that type of company. And so these are all like different business models, but ultimately, as I said, they kind of converge at the end. So what's interesting is when I look at any of these, I kind of feel like they'll eventually have to do the other parts, but it's just a different go-to-market. And going back to the what's your Amazon books is, talking to the founder, identifying why did you choose this route? Who's your target market? Why did you not choose the other routes? And really kind of digging in on their thought process there is how I'd kind of approach it and think about agents in general. I know I kind of jumped around there, but happy to.
That's awesome. And again, it sounds like in some perspective, right, you have organizations and companies building it out internally, but are there any agent companies that you've publicly kind of invested in or excited about? Or is it, again, kind of, rely on the shoulders right now of the folks internally to try to build out some of that automation, those tasks themselves?
No, we've invested in a couple interesting autonomous agent companies. Cognosis was one of the kind of baby AGI inspired companies that'll generate a task list and tackle tasks. And then we started adding recently tools around emails and whatnot, kind of the prosumer style tool. You can just jump in and start using it. There's another company called Azara.ai taking a more AI employee approach, focusing more on helping companies build kind of AI employees that are good at certain workflows. And E2B is another kind of more on the dev tool side of autonomous agents, helping build kind of sandboxes. So those are a few of the investments we've made in the space. It's one of my favorites on the super vertical side. It's not an investment of ours. It was one called Auto RPG. That one, they used Baby AGI to automatically generate full game levels from actually designing the game level space, coming up with a plot line, creating the character stories, and then placing them on the game engine that they had been building out, making it a playable game. So that's one of those super very specific kind of vertically focused types of agents that I thought was pretty exciting.
That's interesting too. And I guess one of the questions that is always lingering around AI and large language models, I think a lot of people who might not have too much knowledge on the back end of what an agent and the actual purpose and goal is, a lot of people are getting scared. They think of an agent, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job or whatever the case may be. So how do you see organizations kind of adopting the idea and integrating that idea with already humans who are working in that organization around agents and trying to help automate and make their life easier? It's not where, hey, we're not looking to take away your role, we're hoping to help you exceed in what you're doing.
I mean, I think there's a couple different approaches, but I think a good philosophy I've seen approach is really thinking of AI as a tool to empower employees to do more. And I think the, kind of the extreme version of that is everybody becomes a manager, right? Is that you can hand off a lot of the execution tasks. And of course, that is going to change the org structure. And maybe there are some tasks that we need humans to do less. And so organizations will adapt and there will be some displacement on specific roles. But if you look at historical any technologies, they tend to create more jobs than they replace, right? I mean, the car replaced the horse buggy driver, but I mean, if you think about car salesmen, mechanics, I mean, the number of jobs the auto industry has created, it completely, outnumbers the number of people who are driving horse-drawn carriages. Yes, like people will need to adapt and industries will change, but again, the reality is like a lot of what people talk about today is what can eventually be done, but there is a little bit of a lead time in that there's just delay in actually implementation. Anytime there's a security concern, things slow down. So human society will adapt accordingly. But these are the right questions to be asking to help everyone make sure they're on top of it.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering, back to your point about some of these vertical agent and AI use cases, I'm curious how much of the market you think will end up being captured by like very vertical solutions to these problems versus like people who are, I've seen this like just in folks reaching out to me and companies being built. There's like a whole batch of companies that are trying to solve this like very general agent problem. And there's like a whole batch of companies that are trying to solve this like very like many different vertical use cases. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on like, obviously it's a huge TAM to try to go for the general agent use cases, but I'm wondering if they're like missing some of the magic that a lot of those vertical use cases are going to end up like probably really solving those problems well. And I'm curious if you have a take on that.
It's a good question. I mean, ultimately, I do think the verticalized approaches, at least more in the short run, are going to be extremely like create a lot of value because there is a lot to be tuned toward the type customer type, the data types they use, the tools they use. And if we're talking about getting the value quickly, the more focused your approach is, the easier and faster you can get to creating value. And the more general you go, the more people you can potentially serve, but the more edge cases you have to account for. And at this point, it seems like there are still a lot of edge cases. There's still so much work to be done in terms of literally being able to do everything, because anytime something does accomplish something, the bar moves faster, right? Initially, it was like, show me an agent that can order pizza. And then now you can order, now that you can order pizza, it's going to be like, show me an agent who can organize my email and draft all my emails for me. But that's coming soon. And the next thing, it's going to be, give me an agent that can, order me a frozen pizza and cook it, and it has to be a robot, right? So the bar is going to keep moving in terms of what everyone will expect. So I think it'll be both, I guess, is where you're going to see a lot of activity. Is people will continue working on the generalized agent because I think there's a lot of excitement for it, but the vertical agents will capture value quicker. But then the knowledge we gain from building these verticalized agents will feed back into these centralized agents as well. And how that happened, whether that's through open source, whether that's through consolidation, that's still to be known because it's a strategy thing on how the industry actually evolves.
Yeah, I'm curious how you think this will play out for consumers. I know for like as somebody who's on the edge and like trying all this stuff, I'm curious if you have this feeling as well. But I feel like I've tried like 100 different of these like verticalized agent use cases, or like it's just like general AI assistant use cases. And it's actually in many ways like I feel personal fatigue of like, I've done this thing, I've done all this setup, I've tried to give this thing all this context, and like what I really want is like something that's like very close to me and it can kind of just go and interact with those tools. And I'm curious if you've seen any like more agent infrastructure plays, or maybe that's just like open source or something like that, where I can give these different agents and vertical use cases like some way to collaborate and talk to one another in some capacity. Do you think that there's like a space for that or a need for that?
I do think so. One of the ways I started building Baby AGI, and again, it's been a little bit since I played with it actually, but really getting it to figuring out how to write its own skills, I think is pretty important. And then being able to learn and store the memory of the task list that it's run previously. And what I noticed as I was using my most recent version of Baby AGI was that, I wanted it to use Crunchbase. I wanted it to look at my Airtable. And then the kind of tasks I was asking it to do were specific to tasks I want done. So I got better and better at those objectives. And what I realized is if you took this to the extreme, I think a really good general agent should have minimal skills, minimal capabilities, minimal knowledge. And the more you use it, the more tailored it becomes to you. So that after you've used this general agent, yours would look really different from mine. It would have very different skill sets and very different knowledge. And I think that sounds efficient, at least theoretically speaking. I haven't seen anybody who's kind of like cracked that nut yet, but I feel like people are building around that direction, and there's a lot of research around. Today it feels more like, and again, I wasn't really active then, but kind of the homebrew computer club moment where like there are people building and like getting benefits of their own generalization agents, but it's not at the point where they've been able to build it that can add value to everybody else. So there's people benefiting from. I think I benefit from my use of agents, but at the same time, like I haven't built a tool that's definitely beneficial to everybody else by any means. But there will be. But I think what you're asking is there going to be like the Mac moment, right? That like cleanly, polishedly like brings it all together that like the average consumer can pick up and start using. I haven't seen that quite yet, but there's a lot of movement toward that.
And we can always hope that Apple does something cool. I feel like again they're very well positioned. I'm also interested. have you personally been exploring, or like companies that you're excited about exploring some of the new like UI surface areas or like different like interaction paradigms with AI? I feel like we've had like three that have been really successful in the last few months, like just pure chat. I think this like whole agent interaction paradigm. I don't know if what the other one is that I was originally thinking about, but at least those two. And I'm curious if you've seen like other paradigms that you think people are picking up on.
I mean, I think one I've seen a lot, and it's not new by any means, and I think the pickup is a little bit slower, is the flowchart style paradigm, right? Being able to chain together prompts, and I've seen a lot of tools building it. None have really picked up. Zapier recently integrated kind of the visual view of actually their flowchart, so that's kind of interesting too. Where previously it was more like a stacked chart, but now you can see the flow of prompts. I think that's an interesting way to be able to build, although for whatever reason, consumers don't seem to really dig in on using flowchart-based tools. Within the chat dynamic, I've seen a few people pick up the tasks being on a sidebar, not in the chat, so you can keep talking while the agent is doing stuff on the background. That feels to me more natural than having to wait. Like if I'm asking ChatGPT to write code, I don't really need to wait for it to write the whole code before asking it the next question. So I think the background task running on the side is an interesting one. And then also, I've seen a couple of people, Cognosis has that. I've seen that recently, but a dynamically generating UI within the chat. So if you ask it to book a flight, dynamically generating the what's your start date, what's your end date, with like a field, with like another field that then has a drop down of all the airports, for example. And so dynamically generating forms based on the query versus asking open-ended text questions, I think is another one that I expect to see. We'll see more of.
Yeah, the task list idea makes so much sense to me. I completely agree with you. It's like what I really would want from a lot of AI tools is just to be able to like click a little checkbox, like, yeah, take this action, yeah, take this action, nope, don't take this action, like reformat it and try something else. So I'm with you on that. I'm curious if you've also seen use cases today that you think will like have a huge impact long term, but for whatever reason, like the current products or model capabilities just like aren't sufficient for that use case to work really well.
I think there's a lot of stuff where you can hack together stuff, but improvement will help make it polished. But I think people have been pretty good about being creative about like what can possibly be done with the existing AI. Nothing immediately pops to mind. I think there's still so much to be built with the current capabilities. That's where my mind has been. I think there are things that would be easier to build with upgraded, better models. But I mean, even when I'm playing with Baby AGI or Instagraph or any of mine, I often use 3.5 just because I feel like there's still more to get out of 3.5. And then just upgrading to 4 just like makes it a better output.
What are you doing to get more out of 3.5 as an example? Like, is it just like better prompting or like building in other systems around it to help support it? Or what does that workflow look like?
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty specific example, but I was able to move a couple of prompts from GPT-4 to 3.5 when I just added a few shot examples. For example, the task list generation, when I actually started, vector pulling past task lists and providing like 3 examples, it was able to generate a pretty good task list that I previously needed to use 4. But by using a few shot, I could move it down to 3.5, which really sped up the actual agent and also made it cheaper too.
Interesting. I guess this is a question more so kind of about the general landscape of VC venture capital firms. Obviously with the influx over the last 18 months of all these AI driven companies, what would you say, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd think of it as a lot of these VCs, when these AI companies first emerged, they wanted to throw all this money towards them saying, hey, we don't want to be left behind. We want to be on this new wave of innovation. I'm sure that a lot of those organizations too came to fruition and also kind of, try to quickly push their go-to-market to align with kind of some of the VC goals as well. What are you seeing in the landscape as far as, organizations that maybe started 12 months ago but have already kind of sizzled down, just investments, or VCs more kind of scarce with their money now after throwing a bunch of money at it? What does that look like for you guys?
I think, as you said, it hasn't even been that long. So people who were throwing money at, 6-8 months ago probably still have that money. So it does take a little bit for these sizzling to happen. But I think, if at pre-seed, earliest investing, you are investing in risky companies. That's pretty known. So a lot of my peers including ourselves, are trying to invest in good founders. And a good founder is, if you look at most successful companies, they've had to pivot a few times because their idea, the markets change, ideas change. So, I think a good founder is able to identify when something is shifting and adapt appropriately to it. I've seen ideas fizzle more than teams. If anything, people are motivated to just like figure out the next exciting to build if one of our ideas doesn't seem to pan out. And then, of course, if you're the type of founder who sees your idea fizzling out and you're bummed and don't want to move on to don't want to build the next thing, then yes, that company will fizzle out. But I think that's where the VC's job is, to help identify the founders who'll get through those tough parts.
And then are you targeting founders in Seattle, or do you have kind of a geographical approach? Is it just US in general, or what is the landscape for, VCs and startups in Seattle specifically?
We invest largely across the US. We don't have a geographic target within the US. So we do invest in Seattle companies, but it's not necessarily a focus. For that one, I mean, my peers who invest purely in the Pacific Northwest would be better at answering that question. But I mean, Seattle's a great market for AI. Obviously, Microsoft being here, there's a lot of people who've been at Microsoft who have close connections there. So they're a big organization. Amazon obviously has a strong presence. AI2, who recently released a model, is one of, a pretty big AI research firm, and they have a lot of talent and people here. So, I mean, between those three, I mean, there's significant amount of technology talent. And a lot of background people with big data, cloud, whatnot, through AWS and Microsoft. So the talent and community. So it's been pretty cool to go to AI events. There's lots of builders, and it's a good mix of startups and big company people, right? You go to these AI Tinker events, you'll see plenty of people from Microsoft and Amazon, as well as people building startups. So it's pretty cool to see.
Do you have any FOMO with the stuff that's happening in San Francisco? Is the vast majority still, even though the Seattle presence is strong, are most of the good companies still coming from San Francisco? I think that's the narrative that San Francisco is portraying, but I don't know from your perspective if that actually ends up being true.
There's definitely a concentration of talent in San Francisco like no other. There's no question about that, especially when it comes to like startup activity and startup knowledge. I do think if you're pushing the needle on like what can be done with LLMs, for example, San Francisco is a really good place to go, just because I think just the number of events there are, the information sharing is just significantly denser. That being said, does it require somebody to be in San Francisco? Not necessarily. It just might take a little more work. But honestly, I feel very close knit and tight with the San Francisco AI community just through my own online activity at Twitter, with the occasional flying down for events and just kind of building one-on-one relationships with a few key folks. So yes, I get some FOMO because there's so many fun events, but at the same time, I'm also grateful that I'm not invited to 5 events a week that I want to go to that's local to me, because that sounds also very exhausting.
Yeah, me and Nolan are both based in Chicago, and I make this comment to people that I talk to all the time. It's a blessing and a curse not being in San Francisco, because I feel like I'd be in that trap as well of getting invited, and like often, like it's also exciting stuff. It's like those are the kinds of things that I kind of would want to go to, and I would end up forcing myself and then being exhausted. So
I have 3 kids, so it's almost like I might have worse FOMO if I like have to stay home and there's an event 30 minutes away, but at least I'm far enough away that like I don't have the immediate FOMO of like, oh man, I could be.
Opportunity cost is slightly too high to jump on a flight from Seattle. But jumping back to one of the threads that you had mentioned a few times, I'm really curious how, it feels like there's like a couple of core pieces of technology that are enabling everything we're seeing with large language models and AI today, or with AI, it's large language models. I think the other core piece that's enabling a lot of stuff, and you mentioned this, is vector databases. I'm curious if you have any take on where that space is going. It feels like there's been a huge influx of companies that are providing vector database solutions. It also feels like in many ways, it's like very much the first iteration of this solution to do semantic type search applications. And I'm curious if you've seen companies or just like have thoughts on where that's going.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, vector search was, when I got introduced to it, was absolutely fascinating, right? Being able to semantically search against a large text database. And then when I started playing, I was doing it pretty locally. And then when I think I got to like 2,000 vectors, it started getting slow when I was just running it in my, Replit non-development environment. And I'm not a developer. So that's when I started looking at tools like Pinecone, which had the vector search capability baked in. I was like, oh, that's great. But it does seem like that functionality is relatively easy to replicate. So you're seeing it an increasing number of places where just being able to do vector search alone might not be enough of a value add to some extent. But I do think there's still what I haven't seen too much on is kind of good workflows for fine-tuning embeddings for your specific use case. I think there's still some opportunity around there. We're still kind of using, I think a lot of people are still using kind of the biggest embeddings, but in reality, you could probably even shrink it down a little bit for your tailored use case. One area that I've been really fascinated with, and there's been some early exploration, is trying combining it with other types of searches. I mean, we've seen a couple of people doing kind of the mixing it with keyword search, which I think is the kind of first version of the mixed keyword and semantic search. But then I think knowledge graphs, I've been kind of digging in the last 6 months, but I think there's a lot more to be done around doing RAG against knowledge graphs. I mean, at the base layer, doing a vector search for a node makes sense, and I've seen LlamaIndex do some of that. But what I'd love to see more of is like using vector searching for 2 nodes and then finding all paths that are 3 edges or less between them to capture the full relationship between 2 objects. And I think there's a lot more interesting semantic experiments that can be done there.
Yeah, I feel like knowledge graphs were having, and just like the graph ecosystem was having this renaissance right before large language models. And like they were kind of like at the taking off point to like becoming much more mainstream. And then large language models happened and like all the excitement sort of left and went to other places. And I'm curious, like once everybody gets sort of comfortable with large language models again, like will people go back and start using graph? Because it seems like it fundamentally solves a lot of these problems. So I agree with you. It's interesting to see. I'm also curious on the vector database topic, whether or not like are you all making investments at the like infrastructure layer, or does it tend to be like much more vertical applications? Like have you considered any of the vector database kind of, maybe not them specifically, but like those types of plays?
Yeah, we're looking at the whole stack in terms of model, infra, and app. I think as a small pre-seed fund, the opportunities for us to invest in model layer is smaller because a lot of these model companies tend to take a lot more capital. Infra, we are definitely looking. There's a lot of exciting kind of open source projects and infra type tools, so we are looking at those. I don't know if we haven't really made. I mean, ETB is probably the closest in terms of kind of a dev sandbox for agents, but it's a space we're looking at continuously.
Yeah, I'm also curious about the open source to VC backed startup pipeline and whether or not that's something that you've seen. Like, is that like a playbook that you're suggesting to people who are like founders that have yet to raise? Like, hey, go and build this open source project and like trying to get some traction, and like that will be our early signal, especially at the pre-seed stage, that this is something that we should probably put some venture capital dollars into? Or does it tend to be like more organic than that they just like make something and then it gets traction and then you're like, that this is great?
I think like anything, going open source or not is ultimately a strategic decision, and it should take into account what makes you as a team unique. I mean, if you're a really smart dev but you have 0 connections and you live in a small town in Europe, then maybe like building an open source project might be a good way to kind of like get attention, work with other devs, and get your name out there. But at the but if you're a multi-exited founder and you can attract any CTO and you can raise $5 million just by calling a few friends, then maybe you don't need to open source your product because you can kind of get that initial kind of like go. And then also, what kind of business are you doing? If you're doing a dev tool, or if you're targeting developers, open source is a great way to capture, because you're targeting specifically your target market. Versus if you're going for, or if you're going for enterprise, it's also a good way to gain credibility by having a lot of open source. If you become the #1 open source, it can help you become credible, which might be easier to sell in enterprise. But then again, if you're going after certain different types of business segments, right? If your ultimate goal is to sell to small businesses, then maybe open sourcing doesn't make sense because it's not going to get their attention, and it just makes it easier for competitors to sell to the same market. So it does ultimately become a very strategic decision, I think.
A really quick follow-up to that. I'm also, do you have similar guidance around like building in public for founders?
In building in public, crowdfunding, open sourcing, there's also some layer of like being public as a benefit, where you're almost like by giving value to the public, you're expecting value back. And it is to some extent a philosophical strategy as well. We obviously think that way very heavily, that like whenever I put value back into the world, it'll come back to me multifold, and I try to live that way. But again, that is more of a philosophy that I understand that not everyone adheres to. So there's that philosophical decision as well. And I think when you're starting a company, it is ultimately you want it to reflect your values. So it is partially like understanding what your values are and how you approach things. Obviously, I'm biased toward open source, but there's plenty of argument and reason to be more closed as well.
Hitting on that founders level too, I'm just curious as far as conversations that you're having, or the majority of conversations you're having with founders, folks who've been entrepreneurs through and through, or are you seeing this shift of a lot of folks who, maybe had a prominent or high level at a big company who, now they have all the resources and tools they think they need to kind of make their own venture, their own company. And you kind of see them shifting from, again, potentially a corporate job to more of that entrepreneur startup lifestyle. Has there been any?
I don't think AI hasn't necessarily changed that too much. There's always a good mix of well experienced founders and brand new founders. I guess the number of experienced founders does grow over time because there's more startups have been around. But there's always well established founders who are typically raising at higher valuations and raising more capital to get going. There's definitely people from industry, what I call the industry expert who's been in an industry for a long time, has found kind of a unique insight and decided to start their own first company. I think those are good investments. And I think there's plenty of stats that show that people who are a little bit older tend to be better investments on average. I think there's plenty of reason for that. Experience speaks. But then, the young founders who have no experience in the work environment sometimes come up with the craziest ideas, right? That nobody who's actually worked would ever think would work. But sometimes it's those ideas that no one thinks would work are the ones that have the highest potential return. So maybe the average might be lower, but I think that the potential upside on some of those unknown founders might be even higher.
That makes sense. So I guess, one of the questions we like to leave our audience with is, in 2024, looking forward, what are things that you are excited or, hope happen in the AI tech world? And other things that maybe are a little scary that you hope maybe don't take place in 2024 quite yet.
It's so fun to build with AI. I hope 2024 is just as fun. And there's just as much fun ideas that I couldn't even think of today. I think the ideal solution is looking back at the end of 2024, looking back and go, wow, look at all these ideas I couldn't have thought of in January, because I feel like that's what 2023 was. Of course, of the ideas I can think of, like I love the autonomous agent space. Would love to see more and more kind of experiments and progress there. As mentioned, knowledge graphs is my recent kind of kick. I'd love to see knowledge graphs being used in autonomous agent memory and whatnot. More on the enterprise side, I think passive AI. Kind of AI that's running in the background. As I mentioned, I have a lot of those running for myself. I think we're starting to see a lot more tools around that. The business model itself will be interesting, but I think those will be really beneficial because if people get it right, the people don't have to actively use it, right? You set it up and it's running in the background, it's collect information and just like getting smarter and becoming more and more useful without people actively engaging. So I think that's a really exciting space for 2024. What I hope doesn't happen in 2024, I hope Sam doesn't get fired. That was sad. I'm excited to see more open and local models progressing as well. So I'd be sad if I didn't see that progress that much. I feel like we're on the bubble of seeing some more and more exciting use cases open and small models. Man, I don't know. It's hard to think of things I don't want to have happen. I'm pretty optimistic about all the exciting things that are happening. Excited to see more in VR, robotics, AR. I'm just answering the first question. I might not even answer the second one. I don't have many negative thoughts.
Fair enough. It was open-ended for you to answer as you wish. And again, Yohei, thank you so much for your time. It was a very insightful conversation. I know you're a busy person, so thanks for taking some time to speak with Logan and I, and everyone listening.
Yeah, Yohei, where can people get in contact with you if they're working on something cool and they're really excited? Do you have somewhere that is like the easiest inbound place?
Yeah, the easiest place for me is Twitter. Probably is. I mean, my DMs are open. I don't necessarily respond to everything, but I do read everything. I just unfortunately don't have time to respond to everything. Or you can find my email. I'm not going to say it here, but if you want to reach me, you can find.
I love that. Awesome. Yohei, thank you for the time. And yeah, this was a ton of fun. And I share the optimism for 2024. I think there's going to be so much cool stuff that's built.
Let's build. Let's have fun.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll do an episode next year, and hopefully we'll be able to say the exact same thing that we hoped.
And let's look back and say what are the things that came in 2024 that we could not have thought of at the beginning of the year.
I'm excited.
All right.
Thank you.